Welcome. Over a decade ago, when I first started studying the Constitution, I learned a few things that I think are very appropriate to bring up right now. Number one, brace yourselves, we're not really using the Constitution anymore. I know that's a shock to everyone here. And number two, if we were to be following the Constitution as written, as intended, I felt like it would really solve the vast majority of the problems our nation's facing today. And so that set me on a cause, really, to help get us back to the Constitution. And I felt the main reason we're not following it is we, the people, don't know the Constitution. Now today, I think most anyone that is paying much attention recognizes that our nation is off track. And really, this is kind of a bipartisan opinion we're seeing, that the vast majority of our nation feels like our nation's off track. And there are some groups out there that are promoting the idea that we need to change the Constitution in order to get our nation back on track. For example, there are groups pushing for an Article 5 convention, sometimes called a convention of states or a convention for proposing amendments or something of that nature. But in Article 5, it defines this convention as a convention where, upon the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states, Congress shall call a convention for proposing amendments. Now today, there are several groups on the right and on the left pushing for various changes to the Constitution through this method. I'm going to especially highlight one organization, the Convention of States, being that they're probably the most well-funded of all of them out there and had the most progress so far in the last 7 or 8 years. And with this idea, the first thing I want to do is ask a simple question, whether you're in favor of having this convention or opposed to it. Would you support the convention if the convention were being promoted as a completely open convention where everything's on the table? Anything and potentially everything in the Constitution is subject to change. And the convention would also have the power to write its own rules for ratification. I've been on a speech tour all across the country, and I've asked this question many times now. And typically, virtually everyone agrees, no, I would not support a convention under those circumstances. Everything's on the table. Convention can write its own rules for ratification. But the reason I bring this up is that is the historical precedent for such a convention. And with that in mind, almost nobody would be supporting it. So the groups that are promoting this idea of having a convention, one of the first things they have to do is convince you that this is not the case. The convention will be limited. And the convention will have to follow the existing rules of ratification rather than creating their own. That's the argument that they're making. They want you to believe that. And as an example of that, we look to the precedent of 1787. That is where the U.S. Constitution was written. And in the 1787 convention, what authority did they have? Was that convention a runaway convention? Did they exceed their authority? Or did they stay within it? Were they a limited convention? And that's really where this all hinges, is what really happened in 1787. So I'm going to start with 3 audio clips from Mark Meckler, co-founder of the organization Convention of States Project, in which he talks about the precedent and the authority of the 1787 convention delegates. So here's our first audio clip.
The greatest authority on the subject is Madison, who was at the 1787 convention himself and wrote in Federalist 40, if we want to know what the authority of the founders, of the framers actually was, look to their commissions. And this is important. I've read all of their commissions. The commissions are the documents that the people bring to the convention that says what their authority is. And you allege that 1787 ran away. I would ask you the question, and it's a critical question, have you read those commissions?
His assertion is, this convention in 1787, if you want to know what their authority was, look to their commissions. And on that, I agree with him. But what is it that he's expecting us to look to and find in those commissions? As we go to another audio clip here, this from a radio interview he did back in 2018.
7 of the commissioners, the first 7 states to call the convention, had this language in their commissions that said the commissioners have any and all authority necessary to render the federal constitution adequate for the exigencies of the Union.
With the 1787 convention, where the Constitution was written, there was a total of 12 states in attendance. Rhode Island did not attend, of the 13. And of those 12, he's saying 7 of the states gave their delegates this language: the commissioner shall have any and all authority necessary. Well, that sounds like they had full authority, right? And if you have a convention with any and all authority, you can't have a runaway convention when everything is already authorized. So that's his argument. The 1787 convention couldn't run away because there was no limit on what they could do. Now, interestingly, as I began challenging him on this, really? 7 of the states said that? He didn't retract this, instead he expanded it. 2 years later, he says this.
And because his underlying premise was 1787 convention was a runaway convention. It's, the premise is the whole thing ran away. That's actually just a lie and a slander against the founders. Here's the deal. He hasn't read the commissions of the delegates who went to that convention. All of them, except for one, had this language in it: the commissioner has any and all authority necessary to render the federal constitution adequate for the exigencies of the union.
Do you notice a problem here? A little bit of an inconsistency. Between 2018 and 2020, somehow a few more states decided they're going to authorize any and all authority necessary. Maybe he just hadn't read all the commissions yet and found all of them except for one would mean 11 of the 12 states authorized any and all authority necessary. Now, when he says their commissions had this language in it, I would expect we can go look up those commissions and we're going to find that language in it. And yet, what do they really say? Is he telling the truth about the 1787 convention? He claimed a majority, whether it was 7 or 11 or some other number, a majority of the commissions had that language in it. And number 2, if that's true, when the convention began questioning their authority, and they did, quite a few of the delegates brought up, wait, do we have the authority to be doing this? I would expect if that language was in their commissions, you would have had at least one delegate who would have stood up in the convention and said, well, here's my commission. It says we have any and all authority necessary right here. Here's the language. So do we have any convention delegates who said that? Look at our commissions. We have any and all authority. And third, if it wasn't a runaway convention, we'd have to somehow show that, hey, this was the majority view. That this is what got the convention to move forward when that question was raised. Do we have the authority? Yes, we have that authority. Look at our commissions. Here it is. If this is true, then he's right. The 1787 convention was fully authorized. It was not a runaway convention, and we don't have a historical precedent to worry about there. Here's the problem. How many states have that language in their commissions? It's not 7, it's not 11, it's not even 1. It's 0. And some of you have heard I put out there a $10,000 challenge regarding these 3 points. Find me even one of the delegate commissions that has that language in it. He said it's in there. Was he lying? Or is it in there? Well, obviously, if it's not in there, he made that up. Why would he do that? Why would he be making up language that's clearly, if anyone does actually read their commissions, and I've often asked this as well, how many have actually read those commissions? And it's very rare that anyone has. I've read them. Wrote quite a long report on them, actually. If you've read those commissions and it doesn't have that language in there, what was his motivation to make that up? And of course, it's that he has to sell this idea that the 1787 convention was not a runaway convention. Therefore, we have nothing to worry about today. If we call for a convention today, it'll follow just like we did then. They follow their commissions. It'll follow their commissions today as well. But if, on the other hand, the 1787 convention was given limited authority and they ignored those limits, well, that sets a very different precedent, doesn't it? So let's get into some of the evidence from 1787, what the delegates themselves had to say about this. So first, we're going to look to delegates who actually did look to their commissions, pointing out language in their commissions and talking about it. The first, right at the beginning of the 1787 convention, the Virginia Plan was introduced. And it posed a great question to the delegates. Should the future of our country be under a federal or national form of government? What we had up until that point was the Articles of Confederation, which was federal. And the Virginia plan was really much more of a national form of government. And being presented with this contradiction, really, between the two types of government, Gouverneur Morris, and that's actually his first name, that's not a title, pretty cool name, Gouverneur Morris. He felt it was necessary to clarify the difference between the two. So right after the Virginia plan was introduced, he declares the difference between the two, between federal and national. The former, federal, rests on the good faith of the parties, where national, the latter, has complete and compulsive operation. Put into modern language, federal, the states voluntarily participate. National has the ability to force their will upon the states. You see the difference? And anyone familiar with the history of our country at that time knew the states were very jealous of their sovereignty, their independence, and were not ready to surrender that independence and sovereignty to a central national form of government. And so this was a great debate that happened in 1787. What type of government were we authorized by our delegate commissions? Remember what Madison said? Look to their commissions. So what we have after this is introduced is some of the delegates began to say, point of order, we don't have that authority. Two of them, for example, Charles Pinckney from South Carolina and Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts. From Madison's own notes, General Pinckney expressed a doubt whether the act of Congress recommending the convention or, and here's the key part, the commissions of the deputies, that's their state commissions, would authorize a discussion of a system founded on different principles from the federal Constitution. Mr. Gerry seemed to entertain the same doubts. You see the issue here. Right away they're saying, our commissions say, I don't think we're supposed to be talking about anything other than a federal constitution. Okay, so that doubt was raised. Another one from New York, we have John Lansing. John Lansing similarly says, the power of the convention was restrained to amendments of a federal nature. And again, he mentions the acts of Congress, but the key one was their real authority. The commissions produced by the several deputations, that's referring to the state commissions. If you are a delegate for the state of New York, for example, you are given a commission from New York. You are authorized, Mr. Lansing, to represent the state of New York at this convention in 1787, and here is what you're authorized to do. Lower, he even goes on to say, New York would never have concurred in sending deputies to the convention if she had supposed the deliberations were to turn on a consolidation of the states and a national government. He actually left the convention, and upon leaving the convention, he wrote a letter to Governor Clinton of New York explaining to him, the convention's going beyond what you as a state government has authorized me to do. I can no longer participate. And so he didn't come back. Interesting. So he felt very clearly that his commission limited him to a federal form of government. Now, what did their commissions actually say? As we look at, for example, the commission from New York, that language was in there, that they were to render the federal Constitution adequate. So Mr. Lansing was correct about his own commission, wasn't he? What about the other two, South Carolina and Massachusetts? Again, we have federal. Render the federal Constitution adequate, with just the slight deviation with South Carolina doesn't know how to spell federal. Or at least they didn't have spelling standards at the time like we do now. So those three, the three that raised those objections we just highlighted, they are correct about their delegate commissions. But what about the other 9 states? How many of them also mentioned that this is a federal constitution we're talking about? And the answer is all of them. Every single delegate commission talks about removing the defects or rendering the federal constitution adequate. All of them talk about it being a federal constitution. None of them suggest any idea or empowering of the creation of a national form of government. So I would say that their concerns are validated here. Now, other delegates also echoed the same idea here. For example, we have William Patterson from New Jersey. We have to keep within the limits. We should be charged by our constituents with usurpation. And his idea was, let's go back to the states, obtain larger powers, and not assume them of ourselves. Before we move forward, he felt like, yeah, we need to do this, but let's do it with authorization. Another one, Luther Martin, I found this one interesting. One reason that he felt that we should not have another convention was when the states discover how much this convention had abused the trust reposed in them, the states would never trust another convention. Now here we are over 230 years later, and I think he's right, actually. That has been the number one reason why we've never used this provision in the Constitution. That we can make amendments to the Constitution with a convention. Was when we look back at what happened in 1787, it's well known that convention did overstep the limits of power it was given. Now, in addition, when the Constitution went to the states for ratification, this issue came up again and again and again. The Anti-Federalists repeatedly pointed out the fact that the 1787 convention was given limited authority and they had exceeded it. Their contention was we shouldn't even be considering this new Constitution because of that. For example, you might have heard of Patrick Henry. That they exceeded their power is perfectly clear, he contends. We also have Robert Whitehill, who says, it is clear they've set aside the laws under which they were appointed. They've overthrown the government which they were called upon to amend. So these charges came up over and over again in the 1787 convention, but also afterwards in the state conventions where they're debating ratification. The convention did not have the authority to be creating a national form of government. And as we know today, those that have studied the Constitution, what we have today is kind of a hybrid. What they finally concluded on was not fully federal, but it was not fully national either. It was national in a list of specific enumerated powers, and then everything else was left to the states or to the people. So in any debate politically, there's usually at least two opposing views, sometimes more. In this case, what was the opposing view? What about delegates who said, hey, look, here's the authority in our commissions? When these other gentlemen brought up this question, this concern, what delegates stood up and said, well, here's my commission, it says we can do this? Look at the language right here. Any and all authority necessary, as Mark Meckler claims. And the problem is we don't find any delegates that said that. We find some that justify it, especially focusing on the necessity of national enforcement power, but not the authority. None of them ever point to language in their commissions saying, right here, any and all authority. But let's look at some of their justifications, because honestly, I feel like the justifications they gave were merited. First of all, we have Edmund Randolph just expressing what a crazy idea this was to have the Articles of Confederation the way they were. I cannot otherwise conceive how they could have formed a system that provided no means of enforcing the powers which were nominally given it. What does he mean? What he's saying there is the Congress was given certain duties which they were not given the power to execute. For example, in fighting our war for independence against Great Britain, they were supposed to raise the funds and provide for the army, but they couldn't require taxation from the states. How do you fund a war when you can't require taxation? Well, they requested, dear states, please send money. And the states, as they would raise funds through taxation and other means, if they had any left over when they're done spending, they might send some into the federal government. Didn't work very well. And that alone was a major problem in our war for independence, was this constant lack of funding coming from the states because Congress did not have the power. So I believe he's right there, that that was a flaw that needed to be corrected. Similarly, we have Alexander Hamilton. The states sent us here to provide for the exigencies, which means urgent needs of the Union. To rely on and propose any plan not adequate to these exigencies merely because it was not clearly within our powers would be to sacrifice the means to the end. Let me ask you, did he just say it is clearly within their powers? No, he just said the opposite, didn't he? Okay, it's not clearly within our powers. He's conceding a bit here. Okay, guys, you're right. Maybe we don't have this power, but This would be foolish not to solve the problems just because we weren't given the authority to do so. And we see this attitude over and over again. For example, let's go to James Madison. It's therefore essential that such changes be instituted by some informal and unauthorized propositions. And on this next portion, here he's talking about the fact that the convention changed the constitutionally defined ratification process. Because in the Articles of Confederation, ratification of any changes had to be ratified by what? Congress and all 13 state legislatures. And they changed that. Not only that, a majority of the state delegate commissions reminded their delegates of that requirement. So it wasn't just in the Articles of Confederation, it was also in their commissions. So with regards to that, he says it's admitted the convention have departed from the tenor of their commission. Their commission required them to follow this ratification process, and they threw it out. Are you beginning to see why I started off today with the question? Would you support a convention that had everything on the table? Anything and everything in the Constitution could be changed, and they can write their own rules for ratification. Because that is what happened in 1787. So we're beginning to see the necessity to create a more national form of government ruled the day. And they changed the rules of ratification. We'll get into that a little further in a moment. Mr. George Mason, there were besides certain crises which all the ordinary cautions yielded to public necessity. What he's saying is, normally we should follow the rules, but we've got some special circumstances here. And then a couple of my favorite ones here. This one from Edmund Randolph. There are great seasons when persons with limited powers are justified in exceeding them. Now again, what are they saying? Are they saying they had unlimited power, like Mark Meckler claimed at the beginning? No, not at all. They're saying we may have limited powers, but we're justified in exceeding them. And now the last one on this list comes from James Wilson. And this one gives us two bits of information. Number one, he again goes to the same idea. The Federal Convention did not act at all upon the powers given them by the states. So he's kind of putting a very clear point on this. Now, I need to tell you the context here. Pennsylvania ratifying convention. So as the anti-federalists began saying things like, we've shown previously here, the convention did not have the authority, we shouldn't even be considering this new constitution. This was his response in defense of their actions. Okay, number one, you're right. We did not act at all upon the powers given us by the states, but. And then here's his justification. They proceeded upon original principles. We're going to define that in just a moment. And having framed a constitution which they thought would promote the happiness of their country, they've submitted it to the people for their consideration, who may either adopt or reject it as they please. This is the authority. This is the authority they acted on. He said, we didn't act on the authority of the states, we acted on the authority of, we're putting it out to the people. Now, James Madison explains this concept a little further still. He says, they chose to exercise the transcendent and precious right of the people to abolish or alter their governments. Does that language sound familiar at all? The language to alter or abolish? Declaration of Independence, right? That's what he's talking about on the previous slide. James Wilson's talking about we appealed to original principles. The original principles are the origin of our country, the Declaration of Independence. The principles of the Declaration of Independence is the right of the people to alter or abolish their government as they see fit. That's the authority that he and James Madison point to for what the convention did. Yes, you're right, we did not use the authority from our delegate commissions. We went to the higher power. This is like if you went to a grocery store and you're talking to the store clerk and say, hey, if I buy a whole case of these apples or whatever, can I get a discount price? I'm sorry, sir, I'm not authorized to give you that kind of a deal. Can I speak to your manager? Well, now you go speak to the manager and sure, I'd be happy to. We'll give you a case quantity discount. You went over the heads of the store clerk to the one with higher authority. Well, in the same way, the 1787 convention, instead of going to the clerk, the states, and asking for the authority, they went to who is the higher power. The next quote here, Madison makes that very clear. The people were, in fact, the fountain of all power. They're the boss at that store, right? The people were, in fact, the fountain of all power, and by resorting to them, all difficulties were got over. They could alter constitutions as they pleased. Well, what does that mean in the contrary then? If they didn't resort to them, they could not alter constitutions as they pleased. That was the point at which they were hung up on in the convention. And this is what he says about what got the convention to move forward. It wasn't, hey, look, we have any and all authority. It was, we're going to go to the higher power. Get that case quantity discount by talking to the manager, the people. One more on the same topic, he says, the plan to be framed and proposed was to be submitted to the people themselves. The disapproval of this supreme authority would destroy it forever. So how did they do that? How did they appeal to the people themselves? The answer is by changing the ratification process. That's what this is all talking about. They threw away this requirement that Congress and all state legislatures had to approve. And instead, they're putting it out to the people themselves. And they felt the best way to do that was the people represented in conventions in each state. So if you look at Article 7 of the Constitution, it defines this. It says the ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the adoption of this Constitution. So they changed who ratified. It's no longer Congress. It's no longer the state legislatures. It's the ratification of the conventions held in each state. And Rhode Island, for example, their convention was every voter. Anyone eligible to vote in the state of Rhode Island got to be part of that convention to vote whether or not to ratify the Constitution. So it really went as close as they could to the people themselves. Interesting. So they acted on the power of the people, not the states. Now we've heard of this organization, the Convention of States. What is a convention of states? Literally, a convention of states is when you have delegates who represent the states. And the Articles of Confederation is a good example of this. Right at the beginning of the Articles of Confederation, it defines, we, the undersigned delegates of the states, are presenting this Articles of Confederation. They truly were delegates of the states, representing the states, and the 1787 convention was called as a convention of the states. In fact, the founders repeatedly called it that. Over and over again, they refer to the 1787 Convention of the States because that's what it was intended to be until it transformed itself by what we covered in the last slides. We're going to represent the people. We're going to appeal to the people. We're going to turn ratification over to the people. They then transform themselves into a convention of the people, which is why the beginning of the Constitution doesn't say, we, the undersigned delegates of the states, does it? What does it say? We all know this part. We, the people. Big difference between the Articles of Confederation and how it was formed versus the Constitution. It was not created by a convention of the states, even though that convention was originally intended to be a convention of the states. It transformed itself into being a convention of the people so that they could alter constitutions as they please, to quote Madison again. Interesting. So today, as we see organizations such as Convention of States claiming that what they're pursuing is a convention of states, just remember what happened last time we had a convention of the states. It transformed itself into being a convention of we the people. So, here's the question. Is the Convention of States project telling the truth about the 1787 precedent? Because if they are, I have $10,000 for you, if you can prove it. And for some reason, I've been offering this $10,000 for more than a year, about a year and a half, and I still have the money. Because number one, they're claiming the commissioners had any and all authority necessary written in their commissions. That language is supposedly in there somewhere. So can we find even one of their delegate commissions that has that language in it? That's Part one of the challenge. Part two, can you find even one delegate who pointed to any and all authority language in their commissions to take care of the concerns of the other delegates in their convention? One who stood up in the convention in 1787 and said, "You're questioning our authority? Here it is. Any and all authority." And last, can you show that this was the majority view of the 1787 convention? Is that what got them to move forward? Or was it, as Madison described, by appealing to the power of the people, all difficulties were got over, we could alter constitutions as we pleased? I think my $10,000 is pretty safe because, you know what, I've read all their commissions. None of them have that language in it. No delegate pointed to the language in their commission saying we have any and all authority. Yes, we have delegates that say, well, you know, I feel like we have the authority. We can do whatever we want and then put it out to the states. None of them pointed to language in their commission. Why is this important? Just to reiterate, this is the only precedent we have for a convention on the national scale that has changed our Constitution. Only one time in our history. And it was a convention of the states that transformed itself into being a convention of the people. Or put more bluntly, it was a runaway convention. Now, just to prove I do still have $10,000 here, there's my digital money for you. I am serious about this. This isn't just a ploy. This isn't just a marketing tactic or something like that. If you can find that language in there, let's talk, because it's not in there. Now, interestingly, ever since then, well over 200 years now, this precedent has been upheld, that conventions don't represent the power of the states. As states have had their own state conventions for revising or replacing their state constitutions. If the state legislatures try to restrict their power, they've been shot down over and over again by their state Supreme Courts. This, from Corpus Juris Secundum, is a summary of what the Supreme Courts of various states have ruled in these types of cases. That the members of a constitutional convention, which is the term they use in legal world here, the members of a constitutional convention are the direct representatives of the people. And as such, their power may not in any respect be limited or restrained by the legislature. Well, that's the exact opposite of what these lobbyist groups are telling our state legislators, isn't it? They're promising them, hey, if you apply for a convention for the limited topic of balanced budget amendment, term limits, or whatever else the lure might be to get them interested, you know what? You can't limit them. The promise is if we limit them to this one topic, that's all they can talk about. That's not what happened last time. In fact, this is such a common problem that the states buy into this promise. You can limit the convention. Nevada, just a few years ago, had applied for the convention under that promise. And when they discovered the true history, that guess what? The states cannot limit the authority of their delegates. They rescinded their application, declaring they had, quote, been induced by fraud to apply for the convention. That's some strong words. You don't hear legislatures very often being that bold. They were induced by fraud to apply for the convention because they recognized the states have no authority to limit the power of the convention. So again, where we began, would you support a convention if it was being promoted as a completely open convention? Well, of course, almost everybody says no to that. And if they had the authority to write their own rules for ratification, again, almost nobody would say that either. If this were being promoted honestly, how many states do you think would have signed on to this convention application presently? I think it'd be 0. Because in my surveys, whether they're liberal or conservative, it doesn't seem to really matter. Virtually nobody supports the idea of a completely open convention that can write the rules for ratification. And when they honestly recognize that that is the historical and legal precedent for such conventions, nobody would have anything to do with it. Unfortunately for people like Mark Meckler, if they were being honest about this, their organization would end up shutting their doors because nobody would be interested. And he'd lose his great paycheck and so on. Now here's where it really comes down to the rubber meets the road, so to speak. What would a convention look like today, in today's political environment? I think this one's quite an interesting part. Because in today's political environment, first of all, who would choose the delegates? I always say he who chooses the delegates chooses the outcome. And if I'm the one handpicking the delegates to the convention, I think it would be a very different outcome than if Nancy Pelosi were handpicking all the delegates to the convention. Is that a fair assumption? Of course. So who chooses the delegates? That's generally assumed that our state legislatures will choose the delegates. And even in the most conservative states that I've toured, I asked them this question: would you be comfortable with your state legislature handpicking the delegates? And the answer I most commonly get is, oh, no, we may have a Republican majority in our state legislature, but we do not have a conservative majority. So what kind of delegates do you think they would support? And the answer always comes back, moderates or liberals. Do you think your state legislature would choose true constitutional limited government conservatives to represent your state? No. Even the most conservative states, that's the answer I get. No way. My state will not be sending constitutional conservatives to this convention. So what can we expect to come out of a convention that is a bunch of moderates and liberals getting together talking about the future of our Constitution? Do you think that the changes that come out of that convention would move us closer to the views of Marx or Madison? And I think the obvious answer there is we'd move much closer to Marx than Madison. I've asked that question to thousands of people, and I always get the same answer. In today's political environment, we can't possibly hope for changes to a constitution that are as conservative as what we already have. Next, do you think lobbyists would have any interest in the outcome of this convention? No, of course not. No, they wouldn't. Absolutely they would. If I was a lobbyist and I have a $100,000 budget each year to influence, bribe, whatever, state legislators, do you think they would increase or decrease my budget for the convention? Is this a bigger deal than an ordinary legislative session? Yeah, absolutely. So they're going to pour a lot more money into the lobbyist efforts for the convention than they do in a normal legislative session. This would be the biggest event in the history of lobbyists. And do you think the convention would be live streamed? Or would it be a closed-door session? And honestly, I see problems with both. Obviously, a closed-door session, who knows what's happening in there. But if it were live streamed, now just back up for a moment, the 1787 convention was a closed-door session. It was so closed-door that Madison's notes, which he took, they're the best notes from the convention, very meticulous, covered almost every conversation in the convention. And he would not allow his notes to be published until after his death. Decades later, we finally found out what really happened in the 1787 convention. So that's one hand. But on the other hand, if it were live streamed, would that make it better? Or would that make it more contentious? Do you think if it was live streamed, and I'm a delegate there, and I'm not upholding the values of Marxism, am I going to get doxxed? You know what doxing means? That's when they publish your personal residence address so that the angry mobs know where to show up with their torches and pitchforks, right? Do you think that would happen in today's political environment? That happened not too long ago to U.S. Supreme Court justices. Absolutely, that's part of the political reality we're facing today. And with that in mind, do you think Antifa, BLM, and other extremist organizations would have any interest in the outcome of a convention? Of course they would. And of course, they would probably be the ones involved in the doxing, threatening, protesting. And regarding the protests, do you think their protests and violence would be peaceful or just mostly peaceful? I think that answers itself, doesn't it? And just by some random chance, if there happened to be some mass shooting around the time of the convention, do you think that would be used to try to influence the delegates of a convention? Absolutely. Of course, the media would try to use that to influence public opinion. The last one on the list, though, is what about foreign interests? Would Russia, China, the United Nations, or others have any interest in the outcome of the convention? And do you think they might have, at least try to have some influence on the outcome of that convention? This is a crazy idea. In today's political environment, how, in these circumstances, can we expect anything of an improvement to come out of a convention held today? This reminds me of the first time there was a movement for an Article 5 convention. right after the U.S. Constitution was written and ratified. 1787 was the convention where they wrote the Constitution. In 1788, it was ratified, declared this is now the ruling law of the land. But the states wanted a Bill of Rights with it and didn't have it yet. And so some of the states started looking to, hey, look, in Article 5, there are two ways of making amendments. One of them is we can have this convention. So some of the states were applying for an Article 5 convention to get the Bill of Rights. And none other than James Madison got out in front of that movement to stop it. He wrote several letters explaining the dangers of having an Article 5 convention. One of those in which he says, having witnessed the difficulties and dangers of the first convention, 1787, I should tremble for the result of a second, meeting in the present temper of America. Now, the present temper of America at that time was, we have this new Constitution, we haven't really tried it yet, and he was concerned that let's at least try out the Constitution for a little while and see how it works before we start talking about having a new convention that might do wholesale sweeping changes to it. And I would say that's the same circumstance we're in right now. We haven't used this new Constitution. It was what he was saying then. I'd say we haven't used our Constitution for quite a few years. Let's try using it for a few years first before we're proposing some changes to it. How would you know it's not working if we're not using it? So, meeting the present temper of America, do you think the present temper of America in 1787, 1788 was better or worse than the present temper we've outlined here? I think today it's a lot worse. And it was pretty contentious even then. I have to say that to propose a convention under these circumstances would be suicidal. And on that, I want to conclude with this one last statement from Daniel Webster. Hold on, my friends, to the Constitution and to the Republic for which it stands. Miracles do not cluster. And what has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world. I think that's a solemn warning we need to remember. We don't need to change the Constitution. We need to understand the Constitution and demand our representatives obey it. Thank you.